Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. I love economics. I've been studying economics for more than 20 years. I've studied different schools of economics, the Chicago school, the Austrian school, Keynesianism. One school I haven't looked a lot into, I've read a little bit, but not much, is the public choice school of economics, which I believe was founded by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, if I'm not mistaken. If I am, then our today's guest can tell me I'm wrong because he knows a little something about it. He's received his MA in philosophy from University College London. He's the former director of content at the Foundation for Economic Education. He's the executive director at Social Evolution, a nonprofit dedicating to solving social problems through innovation. And he is also the author of several books, including The Decentralist. Max Borders, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate you having me.
Okay, so I can get my mind around it and the audience can get their mind around it. What exactly is public choice theory?
I think, and I want to say this in a very tidy way so as not to confuse people. There's a lot of aspects to public choice, but it's basically a subset of economics and a subset of what is known as political economy. And the basic idea is you assume something like Adam Smith's rational self-interest, where rationality is described as a form of self-interest where one is more or less going to try to satisfy wants and needs of his or her own value system. That's basic. It is not predicated on this idea of a utility maximizer, which is it's a theoretical framework used by classical economists, where everything we do, we're trying to do solely for the express purpose of making ourselves happier, where happier is defined as utility. It leaves room for the much more Aristotelian and indeed the other forms of Adam Smith. But the idea is that we're basically self-interested, and I think most people can get down with that idea. But then you take them out of market behaviors and put them in a different context, and that context is known as basically the matrix of relationships around government. Now, you know that governments, even our vaunted democratic republics, have incentives associated with them. And fundamentally, they rely on compulsion to do what they do. Pay your taxes or we throw you in jail, for example, right? So the people we elect to represent us in representative government is a really good example of, the dynamics of public choice. We find that the behavior of most politicians, not all, but most politicians, is predictable, and public choice economics is about such prediction.
Right. So to say that they want to act in their own interest doesn't mean they want to. It means basically they do what they want to do, right? It's kind of tautological. It's that people are acting, they're looking out for number one, for their personal value system, which could include their family, their pet, where they live, whatever. In the case of politicians, it occurs to me that what they value is being elected officials, so that they're going to do what's going to keep getting them elected, including basically selling their votes. And what I mean by that is telling their constituents, I'll get you this, I'll get you that, we'll get a bridge put in town that'll have jobs, that sort of thing. They're not necessarily looking out for the public at large or to protect the Constitution. They're doing what they immediately sense is in their own interest to do.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. So we can imagine, let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that you have these particular animals, political animals, like Bernie Sanders or Ron Paul. Now, Bernie Sanders to a lesser extent these days, but I just don't want to be partisan about it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let's call them idealists. Bernie Sanders is a socialist idealist, and Ron Paul is a libertarian idealist. Both have, shortcomings and problems associated with the way they operate. but generally speaking, they're outliers in the political calculation game, and they were able to sort of stand outside of that in order to be reelected, or so it would seem. But they're kind of rare animals in this sense. So most politicians function according to making certain kinds of trade-offs, and the incentive system in which they make these trade-offs, you're absolutely right. If they want to wield power, they want to keep power, and they know that they're going to have to make trade-offs in order to continue to wield power. And those trade-offs are very different from the kind of trade-offs that someone like a consumer would make in the market, or a business owner would make in the marketplace. It's just a very different kind of economy. The politics of power is another way of putting it. What do I have to do to gain and keep power is different from what do I have to do to make a profit or to benefit myself in mutual exchange. I think that's pretty direct way of describing it.
And the main difference, it seems to me, now, if we're going to apply the model of human behavior that economists would apply to a market, but you apply it to the behavior of politicians, the main difference, it seems, this isn't my own theory. I read this. I'm not trying to come off like a genius. I read this from the public choice writings. But the main difference is that in normal behavior, when you're dealing with a market, I either reap the rewards or I suffer the consequences of my conduct, right? If I go and I buy a shoddy pen, I suffer the consequences of that. Therefore, I don't then go and buy that pen again. And on the flip side of that, the business that's selling pens, if they start losing customers over their shoddy pens, they've got an incentive to correct. But if a politician goes and enacts a tax on a given subset of people, with the popular terms, the billionaires or the 1%, he's not necessarily suffering the consequence of his behavior, nor are the people that vote for him. So the voters can vote for him. He can enact a policy that doesn't actually affect in a negative way the people voting for him or him. In actuality, it might positively affect them because they're maybe getting some wealth redistribution of some sort, and he's benefiting by keeping his job. So that's would be, if not the main difference, one of the main differences, right, between market behavior and political behavior.
Absolutely. We can break it down into a couple little detailed examples, just to riff on what you said, which I think is perfectly right. Imagine in some situations, let's say, okay, and so they'll say, but Max and Michael, democracy is the feedback mechanism that is designed to punish politicians for bad behavior, right? And we know that sometimes that happens, but we also know that there are incumbents that stick around for eons,
Right.
And it's really hard to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And there is a partisan aspect to that, but I think there's also an element of what you can do to shore up and continue to wield your power over time. And part of it has to do with the nature of voting, which I think we can call a low res feedback mechanism. So for example, let's use your example of a pen. If your pen breaks consistently out of the pack of pens, you might say, well, damn it, I'm never going to use this brand of pens again. And other people feel similarly. The pen manufacturer begins to lose customers and therefore market share, and perhaps it even dies out. Okay, so that feedback mechanism of customer satisfaction is essentially gone with politics. It's not gone with politicians, but it's so low res that it comes around every 2 years. We've to use the example, we've forgotten about the pen after 2 years, and we go back to the store and go, oh well, there's only 2 pens. I guess I'll go back with these crappy Bic pens again. Whatever, if you want to use the analogy. But even more importantly than this low res feedback mechanism in terms of how it's situated in time, the rhythms, the cycles of elections are really no good. There are also problems with clustering. So we have to accept a cluster of goods and services from politicians and hope that politician gets this platform, this cluster of goods and services through which, and then we imagine certain things about voters, and they're a part of this whole matrix, by the way, because voters vote for goodies very often, or they vote their ideals, even if their ideals are irrational, because the feedback mechanism, again, isn't direct. And this goes to two more little things I'll share with you briefly, which is rational ignorance and rational irrationality. The first rational is the rationality of economics, which is what is likely to benefit me, right? That's how an economist defines rationality, that this is likely to benefit me in some way or satisfy me in some way. And so you have, in the instance of rational ignorance, you have your politician does something. Let's say they decide to, in horse trading and all the political process, they decide to subsidize mohair. Now, some of your listeners may not know what mohair is, much less that mohair gets subsidized. But back along in World War II, they started subsidizing mohair, and they haven't stopped. It was something that they built, that they made coats out of. It's wool. It's a kind of wool. You shear the goats or the sheep or whatever. I think it's goats. And you create jackets and stuff for the soldiers. Well, once, World War II went away, perhaps so also should the mohair subsidy.
Yeah.
Because that means that you're obliging people to pay all, a certain tiny, even though it's a tiny percentage of their income or in debt spending, to subsidize mohair, where those resources could have been directed somewhere else. But the problem is, not only do people not know what, a lot of people don't even know what mohair is. I didn't until my mother taught me, because she raises goats. But they certainly don't know that mohair is subsidized and has been since World War II. So the ignorance in that situation is rational, because it doesn't really benefit anyone to gain that knowledge. And the cost-benefit analysis of gaining that knowledge, it's inordinately high. It's like, I'm going to spend my day today agitating for mohair reform. Who's ever said that in a million years? But all these kind of little political games that are operating behind the scenes when they're horse trading and doing all this, carrying on in all these political ways, means that all of these, from mohair to bridges to nowhere to Solyndra and solar cells and God knows what, starts to accrete. It starts to pile up. And the entire matrix of what the government does represents costs. And though they sell you the benefits, they never remind you of the costs. And any given one of these little things that adds up is impossible for people to realize.
It's interesting to me what you say, because it reminds me of something I read from Murray Rothbard years ago, where he talked about how the average citizen is just not in their interest to put in a lot of time to learning about what's going on in politics. People have to live their lives. They're going to work. They're raising a family. Then you got to have some recreation. And when I read that, I was in prison. And, while I was in prison for a long time, I had a lot of opportunities to read, study various philosophers, economists, do all these things, and continue to watch the news, stay up to date with what's going on in the world. But the people that I was friends with, my friends and family that were free, they don't have time to do that. They simply can't. I'm studying Austrian economics. Like they don't have the time or the inclination to do such a thing. So, like you said, in this, I never heard of this mohair funding that you're talking about. But now, since I've been out of prison, I'm noticing that I've got so much to do. I don't have time. Like, I'm trying to prepare for this show, for instance. So to prepare for the show, I've got to read. So if I do 3-4 shows a week, I'm studying, like today, I've got to study public choice. Tomorrow, I'm interviewing somebody about COVID. I've got to read about that. I'm doing all that, plus my regular reading. I don't have time to follow current events like I used to. I mean, it's like 10 minutes in the morning. I'm watching the news, maybe a couple articles, and then I'm done. But I'm not working a 9-to-5 job. This is it for me. So it's kind of in my wheelhouse to study this stuff. But my friend he's a landscaper. He goes to work 8-9 hours a day mowing lawns and trimming bushes. He doesn't want to come home and study about mohair.
That's right. I mean, that's absolutely right.
It just doesn't make sense. So I think that
much less is he going to have any incentive whatsoever to read a 2,000-page bill.
Yeah, where it's
omnibus bill.
Inserted, right? So
Yeah.
I think what you're saying, it resonates with me. I think if people consider it, it will resonate with them as well.
I hope so. Although I find that there's another thing that I didn't get to yet, which is not rational ignorance. In other words, it's rational to be ignorant about all the stuff that government does because it's just so much. And we can't, and the cost of opposing any given one of these things is too high relative to the benefit, right? So it's essentially rational to be ignorant about it. That's why it's called that. There's another phenomenon called rational irrationality, which is more like this. Voters have a sort of a vague or generalized belief that something is good, like that poor people ought to have more of food or shelter or this or that. People should have more goodies. But that the way that those, but an economy, or that it's better if we raise the minimum wage, right? Now, almost all economists, even left-wing economists, generally agree that if you raise the cost of something, you're going to get less of it. So if you raise the cost to employ someone, you're going to get fewer employment opportunities for people over the land. And we want people to be able to step on the ladder of opportunity, right? So if you don't have knowledge of economics, which has been proven over and over again. Yes, there are some, lefties love to bring out Carden-Kruger, which is a study that
I was
purported
going
to
to
show
mention
that.
him. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, but
Very dubious, very dubious.
well, exactly. And then Neumark and Washer came back and completely destroyed that research. And Neumark continues to do great stuff in this area that shows that orthodox economics around the subject of labor is absolutely certain.
Okay.
And
Hold on
yet,
one second. I want to say something. Hold your thought, because you just made a very, I think that it really captured exactly what you're talking about. So you mentioned how most economists think, or would argue or believe, however you want to put it, that minimum wage does not achieve its results. That's basically what you're saying, that you're not going to actually raise wages. You're going to increase unemployment. Right when you said that, I was going to say, yes, of course, there was this one study done by Alan Kruger, but it's been refuted. But now think about it. So you say, okay, there's this Kruger study that said it. And then I say, yeah, it's dubious. And then you say, well, there's these other guys that have refuted it. Already you've got people in this
we're getting
position.
deep.
Yeah. How much do they have to read now to find this out? Especially if they just read a Paul Krugman article and he says the idea that the minimum wage cost jobs has already been refuted. I mean, that's he's a columnist. You can read that in 5 minutes and you're done. You don't have to go through all the intricacies that you're talking about. So it's just, I don't know.
And
It's
very
something
few
I find
people have an
frustrating.
incentive to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So when you start to couple these two, I think of them as twin phenomena: rational ignorance and rational irrationality. It's like it's a cheap thing when you don't have to directly feel the punishment. And this is the punchline of that second one. If you don't have directly to feel the punishment of that, namely that you didn't get a job cutting grass like your buddy, if your buddy said, if your buddy was able to learn immediately that minimum wage laws prevented him from cutting grass, then that would be something. But they don't.
No.
But they don't offer that direct pain. And so the rational irrationality really comes about. People hold all kinds of stupid beliefs because they don't feel any direct and immediate pain from the stupidity, right? And that's not to say that people are stupid. It's to say it's rational for them to hold in terms of their benefit, because they can feel good about thinking that people can be helped by having more jobs, or that more income is going to help people. All these very intuitive kinds of things that economists have learned through bitter experience and many, many studies things are not true. Like, it's a good thing to raise the minimum wage rather than have it be a market phenomenon. This starts to get really complicated. So in all the myriad things that we think about in this world, it benefits us to virtue signal. We can get online, for example, and say, oh, why won't these evil so-and-sos raise the minimum wage? And all the friends go, bravo, bravo. And that is an immediate feedback mechanism, right? Whereas it's like, you're not going to be able to, I try to like, look at this economic study from Neumark and Washer, and everybody's eyes glaze over. And like, and I'm paid to do this stuff, right? So I get into it. And I have a direct incentive to understand this so that I can communicate these ideas, but it's just not enough. So when you have representative government, you want to tell people what they want to hear, and you have incentive to do it as a politician. And you know that you can get away with almost murder half the time because nobody is going to have the time, inclination, or money to stop you.
And to your point about not knowing about the harm that's being caused. So if you raise the minimum wage and, Joe doesn't get a job, he doesn't understand why there's no jobs available. He doesn't get, well, there's no entry level positions because they raised the minimum wage. In the meantime, the people who have had their wages raised think it's great. I've got more money now. So to them, it's a benefit. They've got an incentive to keep voting for the minimum wage to go up. But the guy who's unemployed doesn't know that he has a disincentive to vote for it. So
that's right.
So it's just a difficult thing, because then you've got someone like you, and like you said, when someone argues for socialism, what are you gonna? Have you read Mises' social calculation argument about for economic calculation for why socialism? What? Like, yeah, I'm not going through all that. So you're right. Okay, so you have made an argument that public choice dynamics help to explain the collapse of empires. How so?
Well, let me just first say that I have made this argument, and I have taken it to a different place. But I want to give due credit to a brilliant man, and he was a man of the left named Mansur Olson. And Mansur Olson is also considered one of the foremost public choice economists in this. And whether and to what extent I think you would call them precursor public choice theorists like Bastiat and Adam Smith. There are a lot of people who understood these dynamics before Buchanan and Gordon Tullock. But anyway, this guy attributed the rise and fall of empires in great measure, at least, to these dynamics. Now, you can think of it as here's what Mansur Olson taught us, is basically the following. And I'll try to put it in really simple terms because it can be hard. It can be hard to explain this kind of fancy language around it. But he coined the term concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. Okay, concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. So let's start with that as a concept really quickly for your rational egoists out there. And by the way, rational egoism is a really good name for the way people behave in markets versus, as well as how they behave in politics. Just the incentives are different. But let's take this idea of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. We already said that it was really difficult for people to it's really difficult for people to learn what it takes to go up against a mohair subsidy and advocate for its being removed, right? All the goat herders out there who are providing the mohair, though, they have a very strong incentive to continue providing mohair to the market at subsidized prices, right? Because they get all these benefits come tax time, agricultural subsidies, and subsidies around ensuring that, I guess, maybe the government continues to make all of these army jackets and navy jackets and so on using mohair from the goat herders and shearers and so on. That whole industry gets a leg up, and they have every incentive to fight for that to continue, despite what you and I might think about mohair. Now, that's called a concentrated benefit because the mohair provider has a concentrated benefit in that legislation, despite how old it is. Okay. The costs of overturning it, questioning it, understanding it, any of it, are dispersed among 325, 330 million people around the United States. That is so diffuse, so dispersed, that any given person to give a hoot about mohair, as we've already said, is pretty impossible. And indeed, it would be irrational for any given person to do so. So that links up to that concept of rational ignorance. So when you have the diffuse costs, right, it also means it's playing into that, but it's also playing into the fact that it might only cost you a penny to subsidize mohair. It might even cost you half a penny. The problem is, it's not just mohair. It's this, it's that, it's everything. It's under the sun. All those half pennies add up to the point now that not only do we have a transfer state that is unfunded liabilities into the future for welfare programs, entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on, that's already threatens trillions of dollars into the future, as we're sitting on $33 trillion debt, calculable debt. The projected unfunded liabilities are even bigger because all the mohair subsidies and the other subsidies and this and that adds up. And that includes, and this is how we got in contact, was when you had posted something about the military industrial complex that I noticed. And I said, don't forget about public choice. And that started us having a conversation, right? And that's like, so it's like the cost of 10% of GDP going to the military in the military industrial complex. It's not just that. We don't think of it in those terms. It might be $1 billion bomber, but $1 billion in debt spending and or taxation might not register for us immediately in the same way as when we go to the grocery store, buying a couple of steaks registers for us. And we go, oh, wait, maybe we should do pork chops instead. I don't know if we can afford steak this week. A lot of people make those kind of choices and trade-offs every day. So the big idea here is the benefits accrue to special interests. The costs are so diffuse that we don't recognize in any given one of them, even though they add up to an ocean of red ink. And we're drowning in that ocean of red ink now as a society. Mansur Olson said other civilizations have drowned it in red ink. For the Romans, it was what? Bread and circuses. Toward the end of the Roman, and it was the military industrial complex, maintaining the Roman Empire and its incursions into more and more territories to try to extract more and more resources to grow the empire. It reaches scaling limits. And Mansur Olson was brilliant enough to see this, and his insight stays with us today.
So that's how these empires ultimately crash.
That's one way.
That's one way. That's how you tie the public choice dynamics into it.
That's right.
So I'm guessing you see the United States heading in the same direction. It doesn't take a huge leap of logic to see that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm also guessing, and tell me if I'm wrong, that this is the incentive for the contest that you've got going on.
Sure. I mean, at least in part.
Okay.
I see us at the precipice right here.
Okay,
right?
So tell us about the contest. And let me just say, I think that the contest, it's not just a game for you, right? Like, you're really looking for solutions.
I'm absolutely looking for solutions. Okay. And it's not to say that necessarily I'm going to be able to implement those solutions, because in the context, the public choice context we're describing, it would be nigh impossible. It's more an effort, at least at this stage, to change people's mind frame, to change the mindset around these ideas, because we're kind of still living in the box of the democratic republic. And though the founders, and they were absolute geniuses, never before has there been a more sublime group of geniuses as those that showed up in Philadelphia in 1788 and 89. And yet it was imperfect. the dynamics of public choice crept in despite the warnings of both the anti-federalists and even Madison, who was a federalist, who said, yes, we want the Constitution, we're going to have checks and balances. But though they anticipated a lot of the horse trading and a lot of the problems of the Greeks and the Romans, they were unable, and the Persians, they knew all their history, right? But they were unable to figure out a game theoretical set of protocols in the Constitution that would keep it from evolving as it has, which is into an empire. So in a sense, the Republic is dead. We still pay lip service to the idea that we're a democratic republic, but in actuality, we're an empire, and our empire extends to 800 military bases around the world, and we lavish our citizens with all sorts of welfare programs together, which make the welfare warfare state, and it's going to tear us down. Eventually, we're going to buckle under the weight, or if you like the red ink metaphor, we're going to drown in that sea. And I am worried about it. So here's my theory. And of course, theories sometimes never go anywhere. They take forever to implement, but I won't rest until I try to see this implemented somewhere, because at the very least, if I make that effort, I can maybe start to change minds. And that's the hope. But the idea is this: governance, or governments with a big S on the end of plural, right, can be a market phenomenon, could be a market phenomenon. And it's a very simple matter of what if the rules of the game we played by were not imposed but chosen? And it doesn't matter what those rules are necessarily. I mean, it's going to in the long term, because you're going to get evolution's going to play a role in this, and you're going to weed out crappy systems, right? I happen to think that socialist systems are going to be among the first to go, because they're kind of unsustainable. But you might find, modest welfare states that continue to chug along, and their incentives don't wreck them at first, right? And they may last longer than the U.S. Republic has. But whatever your conception of the good, your ideal rule set, this constitution of consent contest is for people to design. What if we had a situation in which your particular conception of the good, your particular ideal rule set, was a secondary consideration, and the primary consideration was creating a framework for experimenting with different forms of governance that people chose, and you get to choose this constitution or not. So imagine a constitution. Have you ever heard of a guy named Lysander Spooner?
Yes. Constitution,
Okay.
no authority.
That's right. No authority. He was like, I never signed this constitution. I never signed this so-called social contract. You'll hear the social contract language being bandied about, but it happens to be hypothetical, tacit, or imaginary. And almost in every case when you hear these great thinkers talking about it. And what I'm saying is, if it were not the case, this is the theory, this is where my hypothesis comes in. If Spooner is right, then perhaps we could have a multilateral contract in which people anywhere in the world could be signatories to this particular kind of social contract, one that you actually sign, and can have a period of expiration. And you may pull out of it, or you may even fork the code and start your own constitution that's slightly different, but retain certain features of the other one, very much like software code. So this idea of software, open source software, very much informs this constitution of consent. But the basic idea comes straight out of Thomas Jefferson, and it was written in the Declaration of Independence. He said, we have these rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that good stuff. And to the extent that the government doesn't abide by this, doesn't provide this for these rights for us, we have a right to abolish it. And that idea is called, he has the term in there, the consent of the governed. I'm taking this Jeffersonian insight, which in the subtitle of my new book, Underthrow, is a dangerous idea. So the dangerous idea is this idea of the consent of the governed. If we had true consent of the governed, we would have markets and governance, and we would be able to choose our governance systems from our particular governance system from a menu of options, from a menu of different governance options that flow from this constitutional framework. So it's a very different way of thinking about governance, and it's very speculative. But the more I can get people to think along those lines, the more I'll be able to say, once you start having governance systems that are being corrupted in the manner that we're talking about, if people are customers, they can flee. And that set of laws can go out of business. That's the idea.
Okay, so you mentioned Lysander Spooner and Thomas Jefferson, right? So Jefferson, of course, in the Declaration says that by the consent of the governed. Jefferson and Thomas Paine also made the argument the earth belongs to the living, that a present generation doesn't have the right to bind future generations to anything. That was behind Jefferson's argument that the government should be overthrown every 20 years or so. Lysander Spooner, in criticizing the United States Constitution, says, look, it's supposed to be based on consent. Only a minority of people living even at the time actually consented to it. Certainly future generations didn't consent to it. Therefore, it's not legitimate.
Correct.
It seems like an airtight argument. And I think it is as applies to the United States Constitution. But I think they're all wrong, and I'll tell you why. The argument is that for a constitution to be legitimate, it has to be relied on the consent of the governed. I think this is wrong. And the answer, I think, lies in Frederick Bastiat and even John Locke, going back to Locke. And again, this is not, when I read Randy Barnett's book, Restoring the Lost Constitution, he pointed out the flaw in Lysander Spooner's logic, and that is this. If we draft the Constitution and all it does is protects the rights of the people that are subject to it, then consent is irrelevant. Because if you live in the jurisdiction that my Constitution is governing, and you say, I'm not going to consent, but you assault me, we still have the right to arrest you and to imprison you or punish you in some way because you have violated my rights. So the consent would not be necessary in that set of circumstances. And I have never heard an argument that defeats Randy Barnett's argument in that sense. Maybe you have one. I don't know, but I've never heard it.
Well, it's funny because Randy Barnett is a big influence on this, even though this whole question of consent, he's happy with hypothetical consent. And I can respond to that in the context of this conversation, if you like. I think generally speaking, though, what I would rather, and I'm happy to do that. We can go into it, but what I would rather do is say, okay, Randy, what if you're wrong? Why shouldn't we be able to experiment? Because as he perhaps more than any other jurist knows, the situation we have right now, the Constitution we have right now, is in tatters, and we are no longer living in a democratic republic with what he would call in his later work the Republican Constitution. It is simply a fig leaf behind which a bunch of authoritarians are acting right now with relative impunity. I mean, just it's breathtaking what the Bidens have been able to get away with recently. And half the country doesn't even realize it because the media won't cover it because they hate Trump so much. Whatever you think about any of these individual politicians, and I don't think much of either one of them, there is a very strange dynamic that is external to the law that is undermining the Constitution as well. It's not just these living constitutionalists who want to interpolate or interpret into ascribing meaning to the Constitution that isn't there. And they've been doing it for more than a century, which has undermined the Constitution. It is also our sort of collective civic understanding around the Constitution, what it means, what it does, and what it ought to do. And that is being corrupted. And I would say to Randy Barnett, even though I think that the argument about consent can be addressed directly, I would say indirectly. It's like, let's look at that. We don't have any empirical evidence that this wouldn't work because it has never been tried. So let's not lapse into the same kind of thinking that King George III would have had when these crazy Whigs proposed this constitutional republic idea, or this consent of the governed idea to begin with. Because it turns out we did have a massive improvement in governance between the constitutional monarchy of King George and the republic of the Lockean republic of Jefferson and the gang. And so I would say,
I like that term, Jefferson and the gang.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
He's
nice.
I love him. I love him. You know, he had his flaws and his sins, but at the end of the day, his ideals were really interesting.
Sure.
And of course, we have Locke to thank for that. But I think Jefferson took it to a new level in his thinking, and particularly in trying to instantiate something. He had this idea of for example, the ward republic, which was an idea of radical subsidiarity, which meant local power was always more powerful than central authority. And he took it further than the states, right? Identifying these wards. And that's because he was constant. And this was an idea he had, or at least expressed, after he was a president for 2 terms. So he's so I would just say there. I want to say to Randy Barnett something along the lines of that I think Lysander Spooner would say, but also my late father, who was, if you notice my accent, I'm Southern, and my dad was very Southern, and he said he used to say to people, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And the point of that, I think, there's wisdom in that I call redneck justice. In the phrase "who the hell," or the question "who the hell do you think you are," could be applied to the much more sophisticated thinking of Lysander Spooner. It's like, who the hell do you think you are to tell me that I must consent to this particular body of law rooted in this Constitution and not be able to opt out of it because of some notion of hypothetical consent?
Can I answer that? Well,
Yeah.
obviously I can. Yeah, I can answer the question. My answer to that is I wouldn't compel anybody to consent to anything. The only thing, well, that's not only thing I would compel them to do is refrain from using force or fraud against the people that have consented. And if they're in that jurisdiction, nobody's going to bother them. No one's going to violate their rights. They're not going to be taxed, so they don't have that. But if they break the law, and the only laws that are there to protect rights, they're subject to punishment. It's like in Bastia, where he talks about self-defense is a right. And if 2 people want to get together for mutual self-defense, that's perfectly appropriate. And it doesn't matter how many times you multiply it, as long as all you're doing is mutual self-defense to protect rights, you're good. And that individual you're talking about doesn't have to consent. It's not even hypothetical. He could say, I don't want to be a part of it. That's fine. If you violate the property, the person, or the liberty of any one of us, we're going to punish you, and we'd be directly within our rights to do so. And I think that kind of would help the Constitution that you're trying to get, because I can't foresee a set of circumstances where everybody on a mass scale, 300 million people, consents, all say, yes, I want this Constitution. And under the sort of Barnett idea, well, okay, you don't have to consent. Just refrain from violating people's rights and you'll be fine.
Yeah, and that's fine as far as it goes. Trouble is, nobody's refraining from violating anyone's rights, and it's because of the public choice dynamics in great measure that they can
Sure.
get away from. They can get away from that. So what then? I believe that if more people embraced not politics, but what I call metapolitics, which is this next level up of thinking in terms of constitutional design and markets and governance, then we can start to live in different systems and yet coexist. And I'll appeal to another fellow who is also at Georgetown, who's a colleague of Randy Barnett, whom you may have heard of, named John Hasnas. John Hasnas has a really interesting legal theory of the radical common law. He doesn't even think that statute law really ought to be at all. And I kind of agree with him. I would say, with the exception of this idea, this constitution, this concept of a constitution of consent that lays out the basic parameters from which the common law can or should flow, that you essentially don't need legislators or legislatures, especially at the federal level. In these subsidiary systems, you might have legislatures. That's fine. And you might want to self-organize with other people into these, let's call them micronations, or states coherent that cohere through this framework. But they're not. But their jurisdictions are much smaller, and the more of them you have, the easier it is to move between and among them. So if you have, and people are like, well, Max, how would this work? How would anybody, you'd have all these states that are having conflicts over various things. It's like, okay, well, we have some of that now. So some of that can be handled in the Constitution itself. But the way we deal with that is the law of torts. And the law of torts, being part of the common law, says exactly what you said. You don't hurt people. You don't make anybody worse off through force, theft, fraud, and other forms of harm. And you adjudicate between and among jurisdictions, or between and among people, based on whether and to what extent they harm someone. And that's it. Society can burgeon based on that, very, according to, at least, I don't want to misattribute a lot of these ideas to John Hasnas, but John Hasnas's theory is that that's all you need is the common law rooted in tort. And for me, this constitution of consent is a way of detailing what a consent-based order looks like, allowing people to have different kind of conceptions of the good and form different communities and governance structures, but keep those pretty small so that people can move between and among them when they start to fail. And that's the big idea. Whether I think that hinges to some degree on the idea of consent, because I just think that it's like, if there is a better law, I believe that people will trust the institutions that they use and build together, not ones that they're imposed on us.
Oh,
right?
I
That are
agree with
imposed
that
on.
100%. I think it's much
Yeah.
better if people consent to it. All I'm thinking about is that if there's people who simply will not give their consent, that doesn't then give them carte blanche to do whatever the heck they want. And
That's
you know what I
right.
mean, they're still subject to the laws, whether they consent or not. Okay, so this contest you've got going, it's basically you want people or teams of people to brainstorm, and you've set out a list of parameters in which they're to operate. And what do they get? So you win the contest. It's not
You
like
get
you're just
$20,000.
yeah, that's not a small chunk of change.
No, that's why I want to encourage everybody listening to give it a shot. Think through it, think about it. Even if you don't entirely agree, you still might have the best constitution, whether or not you agree with every single one of my little guidelines, our guidelines that we've developed. And I'm not, I've got people working with me behind the scenes. I'm the driver of it, certainly, but the whole idea behind this is, I don't know everything, neither do you, but together we can start to crowdsource some amazing ideas. And the best of those ideas will win $20,000. Second place will get $3,000, and third place will get $2,000. So the entire prize pot is $25,000, but we want the winner to get $20K.
That's nice. That's a nice chunk.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Will you be able to provide me with a link that I could attach to the interview so people can just click the link and enter the contest?
Absolutely. I'll do that after the show, but I'll say, for the people who have this in their ear holes right now, that they can go to underthrow.org, go to the nav bar and find contest, and all the information is there.
Perfect. Anything else? Anything we didn't get to, Max, that you think we should address before I let you go?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't try to promote my latest book, which is called
Oh,
Underthrow. How Jefferson's dangerous idea will spark a new revolution. That's the subtitle. And the dangerous idea is that of consent.
and can they find that at the same website that you just gave?
You can, but it'll eventually take you to Amazon. I got
Okay.
to give my pound of flesh to Jeff Bezos. So
As long as you're consenting, there's no
that's right.
problem with it. All
That's
right.
right.
Hey, Max, thanks a lot. And for the
It was a
audience,
pleasure, Michael.
it's been great. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. And remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. And also, I'll be providing a link for my own book. It's only on ebook so far. View from a Cage, My Transformation from Convict to Crusader for Liberty. Buy it. I think you'll love it if you like the show. Thanks, everybody. Take care.